Hello. How are you?
Everybody does need homebrew. Again, Bill just he hit a home run on that one.
Yeah,
It's
but
it's good
is
to
it
see one.
time? Is
What's
it
that?
time to update though? You think? I think the video needs to be updated
Yeah, for
because
sure.
you know.
I think we've better, or at least you have fine tuned your Photoshop skills. So mayhaps.
I think we update the slides, and I think we also make it a little bit more photo accurate to who we are now. Unless we just AI the whole thing, we could just AI the whole thing.
It's true.
I mean, think about this. How cool would it be? The two of us floating heads walking through history. I thought about this for a little while today.
I, I guess so.
As much as I hate AI, it might just be fun. Just to try it.
Hey,
What the
you
hell?
always play around with it. Who knows?
I mean, it could suck, but whatever. I mean, before we go too far, we do have a guest to bring on, but it's always fun, always good to be back in the saddle. And you and I are, we have all kinds of little fun things to announce throughout uh, this episode. We're just, you know, we're just chock
Trailblazer.
full of information.
Trailblazer.
And your semester is what? Probably close to midway, right?
Close. We're actually,
Close-ish.
well, funnily enough, today is technically Lundi Gras, the day before Mardi Gras. So you'll have to wait. I'm gonna tease what's in my cup, but it is Mardi Gras themed.
Mm.
So you'll have to stick around to the very end to find out what I'm sipping on, because I may be altered in mind by the time I get to the end of it.
Well, you're altered in mind in a general sense
That's
most
a
of the
good
time.
point.
So
I'm scared of what's up in here because
I,
sometimes it finds its way out here and gets me in trouble sometimes.
yeah, you terrify me is really, I think, the nicest way that I can say it.
Uh,
Anyways, so we do have a guest. He is the author of Black Redcoats, The Core of Colonial Marines, 1814, 1816. I personally, I am like self-promoters. I think it's because I am something of a self-promoter. I mean, you have to get anywhere in the history world.
very
You
true.
have to constantly be putting yourself out there. And I was scrolling around on social media and I saw Matt Taylor's book and I saw him saying, you need to get me on a podcast and I'll do this. I said, yeah,
Done.
shut up, deal.
Delivered.
Good, good to go. So I have no qualms with bringing on a guest who's just out there pushing their work, which I think, this is a story I was telling you about when we were talking about, what's this episode going to be like? Because, you know, we actually do plan some aspects of our podcast. It was like, I'd never really thought about this. I mean, you hear about the idea of emancipation of American enslaved in the War of Independence, but I think it's because, and we'll get into this in a little bit, we kind of forget the War of 1812, that we just glance right past it, and all of a sudden, we're on to the next, we're on to the next thing. But anyways, let's get Matt Taylor on the show. Matt, welcome to Homebrew
All
History.
right. How
And
are you
he's wearing
going,
the
mate?
show. He's got the shirt on and everything. This is great.
Yeah.
Stand up, show it to him. There he is.
Look it out. Oh,
Now
as I said,
I guess I got to ask the question: where can I find me one of those T-shirts?
see, I just got this printed for myself, but there will inevitably be merchandise. I did packs of playing cards and stuff for ages, so I think we're gonna have to move on.
Hey, playing cards would be an interesting concept. I mean, all right. Again, let the AI run wild, though. We we could come up with some things. Sorry, I had to move my books. They're about to all fall over. I've got all of my book research stuff stacked, and I leaned too far in the chair, and it all started. It's
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I've got an elbow area of books waiting for a disaster.
So, Matt, tell us, I mean, I guess a little bit of how first you discovered the story before we dive into some of the history in the background.
Oh, all right. Well, it's a weird and there's two main tracks to this story. The first one involves the movie Aliens, And the second one involves a unexpected fortuitous Google involving the movie Aliens. So I'm a big fan of Aliens. James Cameron's second Alien film. It's in there. The United States Marines, who are part of that, who go with Ripley to fight the bugs and all that, they're the United States Colonial Marines because they're space colony Marines. So they're not the USMC, they're the USCM, right? And they're one of those kind of mad scale masculine bang bang movie things. If I have a night in with the lads, it's aliens, dog soldiers, starship troopers, Zulu. If you know what I mean, right? Done.
Yeah. Yep.
I was just
A
having
lot
a
of
chat.
Scarlet in that those movies you rattled off there.
Yeah, cha-ching. But what I was chatting with one of the guys online one day, and typical in the form of our chats, I thought, you know what? There's an aliens GIF I want in this conversation. So I went quickly googling for it, and I spotted. I think it might have been the United States Battlefields Trust who did a post on this a million years ago. But it mentioned a load of things that caught my kind of my sentimentalist, romantic, British patriot jingoistic eye, which included things like which we'll get into later, I'm sure you, but included things like a lonely Union Jack in a forest in Florida that's pretty much forgotten about by everybody, but it's still there flying for a very amazing reason. And I caught that, and I thought, that's interesting. You don't normally see kind of a British memorial in the United States, so check that out. And I discovered what I now think of in a kind of weird way as my guys, the Corps of Colonial Marines. And the more and more I went into this story, the more incredible it got. I mean, one of the jokes I have to make is that this is like full-scale cinema history. Like, the drama is there, the incredible righteous storyline is there. That it's unbelievably real, if you see what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
And it just really caught me on kind of an emotional level because, like yourselves, I'm a military history nerd. I thought, this is pretty sweet. I'll go and buy the book. If I want to figure out what shoes the Luftwaffe were wearing in 1943, I'll buy the book. It's this thick, if you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. But I went, and there's no book for these guys. There's academic stuff hither and thither. They pop up in other people's work quite a bit. And there was only one fella who was doing great work on these in the early 21st century, but he sadly died before, I suspect from the notes and stuff I found about him, he probably died not long before doing what became my book. And I was like, I was blown away by this idea, this incredible, righteous British story. And I say that, without any concern, this is part of my history. This is a British story. Mm-hmm. Was unknown. And after a couple of months, I think about a year or so of like scribbling little stories together into little articles, I just woke up one day and I thought, there's probably a book in this. And I got a lot of support from my wife and stuff like that. So I thought, let's give it a whack. And while literally kind of trying to construct the book, my kind of historian brain suddenly lit up, and I was like, oh my God, this isn't just a disparate series of cool stories. There is a central kind of strategic historical thing here that is missing from the War of 1812. 12. And now I feel a little bit like I'm the banner bearer for this argument, which I'm sure we'll get into. Like, ask me later, what was the new thing that you think this has revealed in terms of the history of that war? And it was just a bit of a roller coaster. Like, I wrote this thing, Christ, I think it was over about a month over Christmas. And I did it the hard way. So because I've been doing it for ages, I just banged it all out, and then I'd go back and figure out where all the references went. Knocking over piles of paper. I know I read that somewhere, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I made the same mistake. I'm now trying to unscrew that situation for myself. So I fully understand.
So Matthew, when we first started looking into your book, and one of the books that came to mind is a book I read in graduate school. It's a book by Donald Hickey, the blur really messes it up. So sorry about that.
All right, I've literally got it right here.
Yeah, he's got it right there. I mean, the man, he is on the ball. He's seemingly in our own heads, and that's why he's on our show. But Donald Hickey's arguing here. He's like, this is a forgotten conflict. Yet, your book looks to shed light on something that is even more forgotten, than the War of 1812 itself. So where do you first look when you're looking at primary sources and things like that for the Black Redcoats?
Hey, well, bizarrely, skip to the end. About 10 years after the end of the war in 1825, because a certain United States government just kept on yapping about it, the British government paid a massive compensation payment to the United States for all the property we destroyed in the War of 1812, but also all the enslaved people we took away, because that's potable property in US law terms.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
This meant that I think from 1824 to 1825, the British Empire and the United States set up a joint commission to look at everything that the Brits had destroyed and everyone the Brits had taken away, and confirm whether it was actually us who did it or not, and then we'd figure out a compo payment. And this produced a comedically massive ream of first-hand data, because what you were looking at is slave owners in the United States had to produce evidence that people who'd been lost from enslaved people who'd been lost during the War of 1812 had been taken away by us, but us providing all this incredible detail about people's lives which would otherwise not exist. These people are, enslaved people are invisible in the historical record. But now we have this huge stack because they're desperately saying, no, this guy definitely ran off with the Brits. The Brits definitely took this guy. But then there's a certain irony here, because from the British perspective, this is money we're going to be paying. So our lawyers are going, well, that proves nothing. And scratching that out, if you know what I mean. So we have a weird situation where what you might call the oppressive force is arguing it was so bad, everyone ran away, while the liberating force is saying, well, you can't prove that, I'm not paying out, if you see what I mean. Mm-hmm. But that corpus of evidence it's in all kinds of interesting places. I mean, big credit to various American local museums in places like the Bayside Museum in Maryland, and there's a museum in St. Mary's in Georgia, who have as part of their local history, kind of family history stuff, they digitized tons of this stuff, because obviously, it shows the linkages between families, like white families, free families, and their connections in property and so on, while simultaneously also throwing light on the enslaved people involved. Well, this means that, for example, I think you can still find it on the Library of Congress website in one of their deliciously old-fashioned 1990s website bits, where they've just scanned all these state documents as PDFs. But there's literally I think it's 12 pages, and it lists every single enslaved person we admit to have liberated, with their owners and their state and all this kind of stuff. It also has very interesting data on how the compensation payment was come to, which is very important in British history for a reason I'll explain later. And it also is genuinely funny because it's all wrapped up in quite high level diplomacy, because the British Empire and the United States, both English speaking quasi democracies, we decided to call in a completely impartial mediator, the Tsar of Russia, to do the sign off.
So, but Matthew, this brings us to a discussion that we haven't had too often on here, and I guess it's really our own fault. Slavery in the United States is, I think it's unique among other countries that had and practiced the institution of slavery, because it's race-based here, whereas other places generally they make slaves out of people that they conquer. But in the United States, we have a nation that's born in 1776 in the American Revolution with these ideas of freedom and liberty and equality. And then we go off, we form a nation, we write a constitution, and in that constitution, we explicitly say that, everyone's equal except these people, they're going to be 3/5 of a person. And then, when it comes to the slave trade, we'll kick that down the road. But we also interestingly add in a clause, the fugitive slave clause, into the Constitution, which I think comes into play in a couple of different ways throughout, some of your writing and some of the research here. But I think it's important that we have a discussion too before we jump into this about what the lives of these men who go off and join the Corps Colonial Marines, what their lives look like just briefly before they go into service. And I know, Bo, you and I, we could, both having been in the public histories field and having to talk about slavery and enslaved life in America, we could do this for ever. But I think it's just an interesting piece to bring out.
Well, the first thing I'll say, just to kind of save the United States' blushes a little bit is it's always important for me here to throw down something about British slavery, just to ensure there's a bit of, because it'd be so easy for me to rule Britannia all over this, if you know what I mean, just keep hitting you with that stick, right? But like simultaneously at the same time, the United States has slavery in this era. The British Empire still has slavery.
Right. It's another, 20 years, 30 years?
Yeah,
20
exactly. For 1834, we pack it in. Though we don't technically pack it in immediately. Cha-ching, there's But anyway, British slavery is nearly entirely based in the Caribbean. And it would be fair to say that British slavery is worse than American slavery. And the reason for this is British slavery in the Caribbean is not like in the United States, in the southern states which had slavery, you have that kind of weird feudalistic master-slave thing where, you've got like a paternalistic planter in a big house at the end of a plantation, and everyone lives in kind of a, it's a lie, but it's an intriguing lie about like a cohesive hierarchical community that still lives around each other. British slavery in the Caribbean was largely a cash industry where the people who owned enslaved people lived in Britain, and it was like a middle management class in the Caribbean who worked them to death hard. It was very a full-scale gulag kind of game. And one of the interesting things about the history of British slavery is that the abolitionist movement in Britain was so successful at making slavery embarrassing that you could even argue that in a way it made the final years of slavery slightly worse, because everyone was trying desperately to squeeze as much money out as possible before it collapsed. Everyone knew the end was coming. That's also an argument it's also an argument that some people make about why the Caribbean is even today still comparatively undeveloped, because there was never intention to build a culture, a civilization for the white planter class to live there, if you see what I mean. So they missed out on like a century of development because they were just working the fields, and like the middle management class, they'd go out there, try and make their cash in 5 to 6 years before yellow fever gets them, and get back to Britain, if you see what I mean. So the American model of slavery, which was much more domestic. Again, I say that's the other kind of line I do is, in Britain, we offshored slavery. There was no legal status for slavery here after 1772. So we offshored it and out of minded it. And we allowed, it basically allowed ourselves to pretend that it was something kind of foreign to Britishness. American slavery, again, I don't think it's uncomfortable to say that, American slavery is the original sin of the United States. The United States has these great grand ideals instantly undercut by the presence of slavery in their domestic politics, which, again, the Constitution, stuff like that, they're evidence of the tension. The fact that the word slave doesn't appear in the Constitution, I think, must have took remarkable efforts on the part of the idealists, against the commercial interests of the slave owners, and I always, my usual go-to, I always point to good old Thomas Jefferson, because Jefferson's all of this in one. He's a big thinker. He believes in freedom and liberty. He writes these incredible things about how this should work. He's simultaneously a profiteer and a slave rapist, but like in the Declaration of Independence, there's the very famous bit, all men are created equal. That I think survived because, as I'm sure you guys are already aware, later on in the war, in the original draft, the bit where King George has incited insurrections amongst us was like a paragraph long about how terrible slavery was, and all the slave owners honed in on that and shouted that down, but left all men created equal. And again, Jefferson, for all his definitive crimes, I always credit Jefferson when we have arguments about statues. I always argue that Jefferson deserves a statue because although he was a profiteer and an exploiter, and he took part in the system, he rhetorically and ideologically, he planted the bomb in the American ideal that meant it couldn't last. If you see what I mean, it literally says, it says in the mission statement, all men are created equal. You got
it's right there in the terms of use. It's in the user agreement. Come on.
Yeah, exactly. You've politically, you've either got to square that or get rid of it.
Yeah.
Do you see what I mean? But in terms of like day to day, when it comes to American slavery at this point in the early 1800s, as you say, we're in a weird middle ground because when we get to the War of 1812, we're only a couple of years after the end of the international slave trade, though. Of course, the end of the international slave trade doesn't matter so much because we have to use some agonizingly dehumanizing language in this, because the concepts that people are thinking about are economic, but we're talking about people. But your enslaved population in the United States is self-replicating by 1810.
Yeah, it becomes there's no need for an international market because it becomes domestic on the plantation.
You could even argue that places like Virginia and Maryland, they kind of undercut other slave owners because they were happy to see the end of international slavery because they're the places where people are having the most kids, so they're going to make big money selling slaves internally if there's no international competition. Competition. A very similar thing happened in the British Caribbean with places like Barbados and Jamaica, because they had big populations that were having enough kids, and they were, oh great, we can sell internally to other Caribbean colonies, and we'll be the profit makers, if you see what I mean.
Gosh, that's a great point. Yeah.
But that domestic slavery again, because of the I always it sounds terrible to say, but I always try and bring to the center the endemic nature of sexual violence in slavery. Slavery, that's another one of those things. If it's kind of like when you do like Roman history. If you're ever doing American history before the end of slavery and you're in a slave state, you can go that guy owned slaves, probably raped some, they're surrounded by women who can't say no, and there's no meaningful social consequences, right? But that kind of thing means that your slave population, we might be even in fourth, fifth generation, because enslaved people, they're having kids young, and what's the word? The kind of culture that is building around slavery hasn't yet reached the kind of genuinely kind of horrifying points it reached in, say, the 1830s, 40s, where I think politically the culture turned to, we need to keep enslaved African-derived people in a state of bondage and ignorance. If you see what
we don't have an abolitionist movement yet, not as popular as it would become later. Yeah, it's not even whispering. It's a twinkle in its father's eye.
It's geographic. It's geographic based. Northern states don't have slavery, but again, you've got to cut through that and a bit. While there is some like utopianists who are like slavery shouldn't exist for religious or social reasons, there's also a fair few people who say we don't want slavery because it would bring black people into our state. If you see what I mean, that tension's also present. If you see what I mean. But all the seeds of the stuff that would become much more obvious in the run-up to the American Civil War are already present. You can already feel the tension about how do we expand the United States without expanding slavery, or do we constantly expand and then counter-expand, so to speak, by adding free, and those tensions are already present. Slightly less so, partially because I feel like your first four presidents were from Virginia, so they weren't too perturbed. But that the general kind of feel of of American slavery at this point in the slave states is it doesn't shake anybody's worldview. We are all free people in this glorious free republic. Ignore that, because, and again, I think I don't think it's unfair to say that ideologically, for a lot of people, it was perfectly well understood that free men in a free republic is free white men in a free white republic. They don't necessarily see it as overtly as that yet, but there's white people in America, there's Native Americans, and there's black people, and only one of them is on top. If you see what I mean.
Right. I think that's good. I mean, it's good at least to put that in context and put our situation there in context. I think what we'll do is we'll take a break right now, and we will come right back and actually touch the war, because we have to do that thing. We can't do the thing that we always do, Bo, which is that we start talking about a thing, we never actually get to the meat and potatoes of what we're going to do. We just sit there and stuff ourselves on chips and salsa, and then when the fajitas actually come out, we don't know what to do with ourselves. So, and you're welcome. I'll see you Friday for, I think we're going to tacos and beer. So,
That seems to be the consensus.
But let's do commercial break right now, and we'll come right back for some more. Hey, did you know that Homebrew History now features designs by the bearded historian, our pal Jeff Williams? You can follow the link that'll be right down below us on the YouTube video, or check out the links in the description wherever you're listening to the podcast. And you can go and check out Jeff's Etsy page, where you can find stickers from A Bridge Too Far, which, hey, if you need to know the greatest line from that movie, of course, it's Bring Up the Piet. And you can get Sir Anthony Hopkins as John Frost saying Bring Up the Piet. It's right there. And that's a sticker design specifically for Homebrew History. There's some Oh Brother, Where Art Thou stuff. He's got a whole line now of Kelly's Heroes. And I think we've even got some Tombstone ones out there now. So really, really hitting it just incredibly. And then if you saw over the weekend, I went out for a little stroll, had a water bottle and cap in hand. Jeff actually got me a hat with the Sherwood Rangers Yeomanry flash on top of it. And features those as stickers and flashes on the Etsy page. So be sure to check out the Bearded Historian. And while you're at it, if you're just searching around the internet looking for things, remember that Homebrew History is brought to you by Civil War Trails. And there's probably no better way to explore and come to understand our Civil War than by getting out there, walking the ground, and exploring all of these great historic sites that have been preserved for us to go and visit, and to learn, and to reflect on the greatest conflict to ever come down upon this nation. Fingers crossed that it stays that a ways. But you can check out Civil. Oh my goodness, I forgot what I was doing. You can check out Civil War Trails by visiting the link down below. And when you're out there and you're exploring Virginia battlefields, or you're out in Maryland, or you're skipping up to Pennsylvania, or running all the way across Tennessee, if you see a sign, stop, take a picture, get a selfie with it, and use the hashtag #SignSelfie and tag them on your social media. And it's always good to help get the word out about Civil War Trails, the world's largest outdoor museum. And we will be right back. And now we're back. Look at that. Look at that. We're back.
That's pretty good.
Except for forgetting what the name of Civil War Trails was mid-sentence. I almost called it Chalkboard Homebrew History, which is a great kind of combination of every podcast I've ever been on, melding together.
Yeah, the unholy trifecta. Matthew, before we went to commercial break, we were kind of talking about, the lives, of African-American slaves leading up, to, this conflict, this one that's seemingly forgotten, the War of 1812. Now, obviously there's going to be push and pull factors, right? And you kind of did a little compare and contrast between British and American style slavery, but obviously, both are obviously very detrimental. But obviously there's a lot of, push factors for these, African-American men who are looking to fight alongside the British. what exactly are the British offering these American escapees from slavery? Are they offering them freedom, or are they offering them pay? Is it possible for them to advance in rank? I mean, there's a lot of ways that we can look at that, but I guess we'll start there.
Well, the central point is that when we're going to talk about three theaters, we're going to talk about the Chesapeake Bay, the coast of Georgia, and North Florida. The operations begin in the Chesapeake Bay. In the British plan for this assault in the United States, which is kind of our counterattack after the American invasion of Canada, enslaved people don't appear in the planning at all. I can find like no meaningful reference to them. They're invisible to the white admirals of the Royal Navy as much as anybody else. But the fleet sails into the Chesapeake Bay, and we begin a series of raids. And this is an old school terror campaign. We're not intending to take over. We're intending to set fire to stuff in the safe part of the United States to demonstrate the United States has got itself in a war with world power. This is a big mistake. Look what we can do to you. However, our operations are curtailed by the same issues of the American War of Independence. Militia-based defenders know the ground better. We can only operate in this narrow littoral area before you get lost in the woods, you get ambushed and such like. But that only happens for maybe a month, because in British eyes, out of nowhere, enslaved African Americans in Maryland and Virginia, they come to British forces and they offer help. And they offer help seemingly out of a kind of cultural understanding and memory within African American culture that there's something slightly different about the Brits and their relationship to slavery. I make a big kind of meta sociological argument here that because the United States is explicitly a free country of free people, you've kind of created a category, the categorization of free and unfree, and everyone has to be in one of these two. The British Empire at this point is a quasi-democratic oligarchical aristocracy. The aristocratic ruling class of Britain feel no discomfort whatsoever in offering differing levels of liberty and freedom to everybody within the empire, including white Britons, if you see what I mean. So they feel no hypocrisy whatsoever in saying this bunch of African-derived people can be free, this bunch are enslaved. They don't feel any tension there. It doesn't undercut the ideological underpinnings of the British Empire at all to respond to a localized demand in a way that furthers British interests, if you see what I mean. Mm-hmm. So these enslaved people, they come to the British forces, and initially in an unofficial capacity, they act as guides. They provide intelligence, and our military capacity is instantly insanely better. We're doing night missions. Any attempt by the United States to kind of mass to take us on is blown by enslaved people just coming and telling us what's going on, all this kind of stuff. And amidst that, the core of the appeal of what the British are about to offer appears. I think the earliest I found was I think Captain John Lawrence of HMS Fantôme is responsible for this. Two enslaved blokes, Joshua Cormick and John Silence, they escape from a plantation. They come to HMS Fantôme, and it's unclear what happened, but about 3-4 days later, Captain Lawrence deploys a landing force with these two men. They go back to the plantation, attack it, do a bit of looting, but the mission is actually to liberate the wider families of these two men. That suddenly then spirals into everything. Young men primarily, they do a runner, they come to British forces. Within a couple of weeks, a landing force is led by them back to where they're from, and we're getting out there. We're getting out their mums and dads, we're getting out their wives and their kids and everybody. And that I think was just an apotheosis of these people are coming to us. They're bringing such an incredible value to us. What we can offer in return is what all enslaved people want. It's not just escaping in the night, if you see what I mean. It's getting everybody out. I mean, the classic example of this is, like, again, you look at the numbers. escape from slavery. It's a young man's game for the vast majority of the time in the United States. You got to do a runner, you got to go miles, you got to evade slave patrols, dogs, and all that. And it led to kind of common wisdom in slavery. Like women with kids don't run because they're content. Probably more because they don't want their toddlers getting ate by a dog in a field in the middle of the night, you know. But old people, they're content, they don't run. But guess what? When there's a British warship sat a couple of miles offshore and we're doing landing invasions, we're getting 60-plus-year-olds, we're getting babes in arms. It's the calculus of the slave society's kind of security mode is instantly undercut. The line I often use when talking about any slave society, including British ones, but I like it for America as well, is slavery is a precarious security society. You're constantly authoritarianly hammering means to maintain security, but you can never know if you've done enough. So you live in constant fear. So, there's just a constant cycle, if you know what I mean. But this kind of back and forth, which was kind of done by the theatre commanders, John Warren, later replaced by Cochrane, that was formalised in May, I think it was May 1814, where we decide, let's set up a military unit. Rather than just using them in all these unofficial capacities, which has had this incredible effect on our abilities, let's actually put together a red-coated, all-black unit. I mean, and we're in the letters, like Cochrane and Coburn, who are the two major commanders at this point, they're completely open about it. Like, we need these blokes, we need them looking good, we need them in red coats, because they will be an inducement to more people to come to us. And every fit young man we get who's happy to hold a gun, that increases our striking power, because this is the War of 1812. In British eyes, this is a sideshow. We've got a major French dictator to deal with, and this campaign in the Chesapeake is a sideshow of a sideshow, because defending the Canadian border is our primary aim, if you see what I mean. So anything that increases our striking power, we need to take advantage of. And the colonial Marines, when they come into being, they have that instantaneous effect. I mean, there's a story that's in a load of different sources and a load of newspapers that I feel really comfortable saying probably true, because it appears too many places and it's kind of has this immediacy which sounds truthful. But like literally in their first action as a unit, as a red-coated part of the British forces, the Colonial Marines attack a little fortification at Pungoteague Creek, which is in Maryland, I think, also in Virginia. And the Colonial Marines, having took part in the capture of the fortification, they launch into the nearby countryside in kind of a scout skirmish manner in a way that British forces would not have the confidence to do. But they launch into that countryside in a scout skirmish manner. They discover an American ambush, and the ambush is blown because, on all the stories, a Virginia militiaman is so angry at seeing an armed black man, he fires early and snaps the ambush. Allowing the Colonial Marines to engage in some skirmishing, to disengage, allows the landing force to engage with no further casualties. We lost one Colonial Marine in that action, the first KIA. Michael Harding was his name. He was from Virginia, and he will live forever for dying for king and freedom. That impact in our operations is instantaneous everywhere around Virginia and Maryland. And the big one I usually looked at, I think it was Brigadier Hungerford of the Virginia militia. He wrote probably the most on-the-nose letter you could do to Washington, basically saying we are incapable of defending ourselves now, because British forces now have access to like the secret enslaved underground world of hidden paths, perhaps through the forest and all this. Any attempt to mass is blown, any attempt to ambush is blown, and we're getting ambushed by them as we attempt to move. And crucially, our defense paradigm in this era even is militia based, and no one's willing to leave their home because their slaves might run off or burn the house while they're gone. So we can't call out the militia anymore. We need federal help, and federal help is lacking because the United States' forces are mainly up in Canada. There's a couple down in Tennessee with Jackson as well. And anyway, the American military is, a constabulary force attempting to do an invasion of a neighboring country, which isn't hot as a plot anyway. And this means that the Colonial Marines, like as a unit, have this effect on the campaign in the Chesapeake that is hundreds of times more than their numbers. I reckon they maybe only reached 400-ish or 500-ish men under arms. But the British force in the region, even when army reinforcements arrive, we only maybe get to 5,000, if you know what I mean. So again, you know, it's a big proportion of our overall force in this region. And again, yeah, you can get very sentimental and romantic about this, and kind of let your imagination run wild, if you know what I mean, about, you know, what it must have been like to be enslaved and be, you know, a boy in like the racist language of the time, but then to like come back, not just leave, but to come back as a Marine, a man, a free man, even better, to my eye, a British free man, the enemy of the people who previously enslaved you. You know, and again, that can sound quite over the top and cinematic, but I mean, I've got in all my primary sources one slave owner, a guy called Kilgore, I think it was Richard Kilgore. He faced off against one of his former slaves who came back as a colonial marine, and he wrote a big like testimony about it as part of a newspaper. Like, he wrote an angry letter to a newspaper, classic, describing what had happened. And his former enslaved person, a lad called William, who was in First Company, I think, at this point, yeah, he said to his enslaved man, you know, you're destroying the life we built together. You know, kind of appealing to that paternalistic idea of what enslavement is. And William Kilgore, the formerly enslaved man who is now a British soldier, so it gives his pocket a tap, and it jingles because it's got cash in it, and he goes, "It's nothing personal, mate, but they're paying me." And then he bails with all his family, having set fire to the place. You know, it's and sorry, I could go on. I'll let you get an edge in, but I've got more.
I know it's like we jump ahead a little bit when we do this, but you know, when you say you think about what they must have felt like going back and marching through these places. I mean, it's the same thing. You know, we see with stories that come from United States colored troops in the American Civil War. You know, some of these units that come out of the Carolinas, some of the, you know, even, you know, you think about the most famous of all of them, probably the 54th Massachusetts, made up of a lot of men, free men of color, and then you've got some formerly enslaved men that come up from there, and they end up back down south, back in South Carolina, and for the first time, you know, they're marching around in Union blue, right? And it's not just a United States Army anymore. Now it's an army of liberation, in the same way that maybe 40, 50 years earlier, these men are marching through Virginia and through Florida, and it's a very, very different world for them. So we talked a little about Chesapeake. Where else are we looking at here?
Well, the force that was largely raised in the Chesapeake towards the end of the war, towards the end of 1814, after we destroyed Washington and we hadn't took Baltimore, we scaled back operations largely because DC was seen as our big victory, if you know what I mean. You know, it was very much. There's a certain irony there that I think a little bit like we kind of got blinded by kind of European thinking. We'll burn their capital, that'll show them, forgetting that Washington DC is like, you know, a building site, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
You know, but the Chesapeake force, a majority of it, though some still remain, the Chesapeake force is then pulled south to invade Cumberland Island, which is just off the coast of Georgia. And we basically do the same thing all over again, but even more effectively. I think British forces were only off Georgia for like maybe a month or so, and 30 people a day, every day, escaped slavery to British forces. There's also an intriguing note here that while we were raiding, attacking places like St. Mary's and various the Rice Coast area of Georgia, as it was then called, we were building our force. So the Colonial Marines are expanding, but we also bring in some West Indies regiments, which is the British Black unit that we use largely for internal policing in the Caribbean. And that force was intending a push to Savannah, the capital of Georgia. And at this time, Georgia is like 45% enslaved African American, while the coast where Parked off is like 75% enslaved. And so that meant the British army we were building on Cumberland Island was, as the war ended, was actually majority black. It was mainly colonial Marines, African Americans who'd escaped slavery, and West Indies black troops. So I invite all Americans to imagine what would have happened if a British army made up almost entirely of free African-derived people had advanced into Georgia in 1815. If you see what I mean, and British commanders were completely over. They were full on kind of thinking, we might actually get Georgia out of America. Might get it back as a free black protectorate. If you see what I mean, quite pie in the sky stuff, but not beyond the realms of possibility in terms of what was really coming down the track. That's it. The sudden end of the war, which is largely a result of how kind of like comedically meaningless the war had become, if you know what I mean. In the sense that American strategic objectives had missed or failed, and Britain didn't really have a strategic objective apart from putting America back in the box, if you see what I mean. So the war suddenly ended because we were all terribly embarrassed by it, and that's kind of like set the standard for our memory of it now, if you know what I mean. But so that's super intriguing itself. And then when we jump down to Florida, Florida's even more crazed and mental because Florida is Spanish territory. It's part of the Spanish Empire. It's been nibbled away by the United States. It was the constitutional situation in Florida is so crazy that I think in Mobile is functionally part of the United States now. But I think there's still a Spanish garrison holding the fort in the town, flying the flag for the Spanish Empire. That's the level we're at here. It's really the Spanish Empire is coming apart. America's nibbling away at it. But Andrew Jackson, who's very much the villain in my piece, Andrew Jackson had
That's not new. He's a villain in a lot of pieces.
Yeah. But Andrew Jackson had recently defeated the Red Stick faction of the Creek, who are the revivalist anti-American Creek, and they had fled into North Florida, and creating something of a refugee and famine crisis. And almost by happenstance, British forces arrive in the region at the same time. And we begin the same thing again. We begin freeing and arming escaped slaves, both from Spanish slavery and American slavery. And we make alliances with these refugee Native Americans, and begin arming them up as well. Which, ironically, like the fear of British support for them was one of the drivers for Jackson's campaign against them the year before. There wasn't actually British support, but there was an ongoing theory that all uprisings from Native Americans had to have something. We had to have something to do with it, if you see what I mean. In North Florida, what happened here is unbelievably, like, again, so cool and like righteous. So the Native Americans and free African derived people in North Florida, they coalesced together around a place called Prospect Bluff, where the Brits, and aided by the Native Americans and African Americans, build a massive fortification, which is known largely in history as Negro Fort, because that was what the Americans named it later. This fortification is the castle at the center of the ethnogenesis of what is largely now the Afro-Seminole people, the Native American, African American people who still live today in parts of Florida as well as in the Bahamas. So in the midst of all this here, we've got a war. The classic thing: wars displace populations and build new populations. In this scenario, we've got British forces providing cover for the development of a new Afro-Native American culture in North Florida. That unit, again, the war suddenly ends. It has very little meaningful action. It does have a couple of cool skirmishes with various American forces. It has a little fight at Pensacola. Sends Davy Crockett packing at one point. Have that. But when the war ends, the force in North Florida, unlike all the other forces, which I'll talk about in a minute, didn't leave, because North Florida isn't America. The United States is over the border in Georgia. And although British forces offered to evacuate people, not everybody went. So lots of escaped African Americans and Native Americans remained around Negro Fort. And reading older American histories, it suffers a bit of a whitewashing in that it becomes like in a lot of American histories, it becomes this kind of like this, this nest of bandits hiding in the forest, ooh, kind of thing. That's nonsense. It is a heavily armed, because we leave tons of cannon, muskets, and guns and swords behind. It's a heavily armed modern fortification, completely out in the open, controlling a strategic river, surrounded by 50 to 60 miles of agricultural community containing thousands of people. It is very much not a nest of anyone hiding. They are living free and building a new culture, a new ethnic group in this area. Andrew Jackson, God bless him, he engages a military conspiracy in early 1816 to kick off a showdown with this community, to use it as an excuse to destroy that community. And he does this. He launches an invasion. There's like a week-long siege of the fort. Eventually the fort is destroyed by the happenstance of a heated cannonball hitting a powder magazine, blows the fort up, killing nearly everybody at that point defending the fort, though a large percentage of the population had fled deeper into Florida. And then suddenly we move from the War of 1812 into the Seminole Wars, because over the following 20 or so years, over the next following 20 or so years, as the United States conquers Florida, every now and again, escaped African Americans who'd had British training, sometimes still in their redcoats, they pop up and they're leading free African-derived people, or the kind of the African-derived people who are allied to Native Americans in kind of that like weird middle ground between serf and slave, that kind of thing, if you know what I mean. Very different from chattel slavery is the core message there. And they're still fighting, and they're fighting literally for decades afterwards. A core part of this story is there's a Royal Marines officer called Edward Nichols, who's a legend in the Royal Marines. He's called Fighting Nichols. He lost, like, he's one of these blokes who kept on losing eyes and arms and stuff, but kept on going. But he was the commander of the fort we built, and he advocated to the British government that we should even take this community under the British Empire's umbrella. Forget the Spanish; they're out of the game. This North Florida enclave should be a British protectorate, which he got rebuffed on when it had a bit of a damaging effect on his career. But he inspired the Native Americans and African Americans so intensely. He did this incredible speech at Pensacola, where the opening line to the escaped enslaved people was, "You are already heroes because you have dared to be free." And somehow it got better from that. But anyway, he inspired them so strongly in their desire to maintain their freedom that even after British forces left the region, the primarily the African American group who'd been part of his corps of colonial Marines, they continued to form kind of this Praetorian military class of modern soldiers amidst this Afro-Native American community, doing pickets out miles, password checkings, and things like this, and really, I say again, not like a little bandit nest of scared people in a forest at all, if you see what I mean. And when American forces actually came to the fort for the battle that would eventually destroy the fort, the military commander of the fort, who was a former colonial Marine called Garcon, he parlayed with the Americans, and the Americans said, give up and return to lifelong slavery. And so solid negotiating tactic there. And Garcon said, "Oh, I'm very sorry. I've been left in command of this fort by the King of Great Britain, so I can't surrender it." And then the fort rang up a Union Jack to show that they regard themselves as under British protection, which the American force immediately ignored and attacked anyway. And that flag is the core motivator to me writing this story, because some genius in the US Forestry Service has stuck a flagpole up in the middle of the empty clearing in the forest on the Apalachicola River, and there's still a Union Jack there. It's currently very bleached, I think, because of the last couple of hurricanes. It's still there, and 300 African American and Native American people died under that flag defending their freedom. And they died, in my sentimental mind, as British people, died as me. And that's why I feel so strong about this story and carrying it. That leads on to when you put these three theaters together in the War of 1812, the exploitation, the military exploitation of slavery in the United States, I think in the first instance, it's the reason we burnt Washington, D.C. Why is the entire American countryside around your capital city completely pacified so you can barely drag anybody out to get kicked in at Bladensburg? It's because no one's willing to leave their homes to defend in a field somewhere, not knowing what's happening back home. There's even first-hand accounts from Americans at Bladensburg saying that the army at Bladensburg was riven by a rumor that the slaves are already rising up in DC anyway. Why are we even here?
Mm-hmm.
And then at the Battle of Bladensburg, the Colonial Marines are there. And where are they? They're in the Light Division. They're in the part of the army that punches across the bridge at Bladensburg and smacks into the enemy line, having charged out of an orchard into close combat. If you were just some random American farmer, you're already fighting Napoleonic War veterans. There's a lot of fear there. But look, it's enslaved people who are all around us. They're at home with my kids and wife. And they're here and they've got bayonets. What's happening back at home? And then, as we all know, the Bladensburg army just unzips, and falls apart. I think the fear of what could happen if the British are directly supporting enslaved people was a lot more central than many people. Yeah, and in the interests of a coherent national narrative, we've dropped that bit, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of a lesson that's not unlearned by the U.S. South. And I guess, Matt, in your opinion, sort of in the post-war years, how does that affect the American psyche in the U.S. South?
I think it has a hell of a lot more going on than we tend to remember. Because again, the War of 1812 gets rapidly turned into this. It's quite interesting for me because I think what happened was there was such relief at the sudden end of the war. Like, people tend to forget that in some of the end of war celebrations in America, people put up British flags as well as American flags because they were so happy we'd come to this happy accord, if you know what I mean. Yeah. But that sensation of relief and when Americans do remember the War of 1812, they do tend to remember it as like the Second War of Independence. We were under existential threat. Why were you under existential threat? If you see what I mean, is the core message, is the argument I put forward here.
Yeah, and we're doing the same thing on Canada.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, and that's and that's it. I'd even argue, it's right there in the Star Spangled Banner, in the verse that no one ever sings, about we've killed all those slaves who tried to burn our homes. Wonder who those lot are. But yeah, I think it's simultaneously locked in this idea, which was inevitable anyway, that the African American population are an alien element that can't be trusted. And it also I think pushed us towards things like Manifest Destiny in some ways. So like the Jacksonian conquest of Florida, seen through this lens, is a necessary step to cut off a region filled with hostile Native Americans and hostile escaped enslaved people that, because of its location, has direct access to the foreign Caribbean from which they can derive support, weapons, and so on. So you need to take that peninsula out. And once you've took that peninsula out, you need to depopulate it of all the people you don't trust. So the Trail of Tears comes out with this, So internally in the United States, I think it had a much bigger effect than is generally regarded, in the same way that in British military terms, it had a much greater strategic effect on how we actually played this war, if you see what I mean, than we tend to remember. It was all very theatre focused for us. And I mean, the next kind of stage of this, I think, is to then talk about what happens to the people that we evacuate. But is there anything else you'd like to ask me before we go into that?
I was going to say, I think royal accolades, does the crown recognize these individuals?
Yeah. What's the word? The Colonial Marines. So throughout the war, not all escaped African Americans are becoming soldiers. Tons of them are non-combatants, and the offer we gave of freedom which was called Cochrane's Proclamation, which was deeply ironic because Admiral Cochrane was also a slave owner. Just in case hypocrisy has hid itself under a bushel, man. the vast majority of the African Americans who escaped to us were relocated to Canada in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. They were given their freedom. So they were assumed to be free as soon as they were in our hands, and they became free in Canada. They suffered both kind of from like neglect and indifference initially in Canada, but London, largely in the form of the Earl Bathurst, who was Secretary of State for the colonies, hammered the Nova Scotian colonial authorities that we've made like a debt of honor to these people, that they have to be supported. So whatever their difficulties, they had this special kind of connection to the system they're now living within, banging up against good old-fashioned racism and all that kind of stuff, but still with a kind of a unique status. But the colonial marines themselves at the end of the war, so the actual uniformed soldiers, they were moved to Bermuda, where they were maintained well into 1816. I think just in case we kicked off a war with America again, so we could swing them right back in and do it all over again. But mid 1816, it's not going to happen. We're winding down our armies and military in general because Napoleon's out of the picture and all this. We've got peace to build. So the colonial marines are disbanded as one group to the same region of South Central Trinidad, and you can find it on a map. You go to Trinidad. You look for the town of Moruga on the south coast. Go north a bit. There's a bunch of villages: 4th Company, 5th Company, 3rd Company. Why don't you visit 5th Company Baptist Primary School? All these villages are named after the colonial marine units who are settled there as free farming landholders on an island that is still filled with British slave plantations.
Wow.
And that community still exists. They were very insular for a good century afterwards, and they exist today, and they exist very obviously because the vast majority of them have maintained a very obviously American Virginian Baptist religion. And just if that isn't on the nose enough, the ethnic group recognized by Trinidad and Tobago today is called the Americans, and they're deeply, deeply proud of the fact that they fought for their freedom and gained their independence 20 years before anyone in the British Empire, and they're not one of the tragic heroic tales of slave resistance that is pretty much the rest of American enslaved history. These people fought, got out, lived free, and that's their real legacy. There's no greater victory than the fact there's kids alive now in Trinidad, if you know what I mean, who are descended from this. But that also means, like I briefly mentioned, the Afro-Seminole. When Florida was being conquered, small numbers of these Afro-Native American people, some of whom had formerly been colonial marines, they evacuated. You can go to Andros Island in the Bahamas and go to Nicholstown, which was founded by these people. So you've got this arc along the edge of the United States eastern seaboard from Nova Scotia to the Bahamas down to Trinidad, with places in like historical interest in Bermuda and stuff that are all these people who escaped American slavery. And by escaping American slavery, by going away, they've escaped the narrative of American slavery as well. So the history of American slavery completely discounts them. And because they went into all these different political, these different national histories, they're a minority within those national histories. So there isn't an overarching kind of story really told about them either, if you know what I mean. But the emancipation of enslaved people by British forces during the War of 1812 was the largest emancipation of enslaved people in American history between the War of Independence and the end of the American Civil War. And they fought for it themselves, and they didn't ask us for it. Benevolent Brits, Rule Britannia, didn't come in and make this happen. Brits rocked in to set fire to American stuff, and these people came to us and negotiated with their own agency their capacity to help us and what they were going to get for it. It's an incredible tale of Black history, of Black agency in a hemisphere where there was so little of it.
We could do this for another hour, but Bo, how about we bring on little bit of doohickey.
Yes. So, Matt, boohickey is something that I've come to describe as something that is absolutely rubbish, something that is just absolutely just brain dead, something that, is in sort of popular narrative that people oftentimes get wrong about a particular subject. When it comes to the core colonial Marines, when it comes to the Black Redcoats, man, what's the boohickey?
Poor. I think it would have to be. It would have to be that the British treatment of escapees from American slavery was entirely motivated by this kind of benevolent abolitionist turn in British politics.
Mhm.
That every time I tell this story, someone wants to come out of the audience and go, aha. So, like with the West Africa Squadron, which is another kind of bludgeon occasionally used to get rid of British guilt for our history of slavery. This is another time we just did the right thing. And I'm like, yeah, we did, but we didn't set out to do it.
But
yeah, there's always an asterisk,
Yeah, exactly. And again, I'm not denying, like, there's lots of people in this story who are like full-scale heroes, if you know what I mean. But there's lots of hypocrites as well, if you know what I mean.
Sure.
well, Bo, I think time we hit with this. I mean, it's been in a whole hour and 6 minutes so far, and we haven't even talked about it yet. So, Bo, I guess I'll ask you first. What's in your cup?
It's true. Like I said earlier on, today is Lundi Gras, the day before Mardi Gras Fat Tuesday. So I went into my liquor cabinet, and what do I find? I find a bottle of King Cake vodka. So that is what I've been sipping on. It's almost gone now. But it has a little sweet aftertone taste, very smooth, just over ice. It is fantastic. Joey, what is in your cup?
I'm actually going to pass the buck on to Matt because nobody wants to know what's
That's
in
true.
mine. Matt, what's in your cup?
I am drinking an incredibly tepid cup of tea because
Uh-huh.
I am entirely a stereotype.
You know what? You're not alone though. So there's a whole cup of tea here, nice big fat mug of green tea brewed this afternoon. Now it's gone cold because it's been an hour, but
We did that
at least
thing.
at least it's still going. Uh, well, Matt, want to thank you again for coming on the show. And again, the book, if you can't see it right there in front of you, is called Black Redcoats, The Corps of Colonial Marines, 1814, 1816. We've been talking with Matthew Taylor for the last hour. And Matt, what just a great discussion, great delight. And where can people find the book?
In the United States, you can find it on US Amazon. You can buy it via Casemate, which is Pen and Sword, my UK publisher's US imprint. Yeah, go and buy it. You won't regret it.
There we go. You heard it from the self-promoter himself.
That's a good point. I'll say, Matt, we have all kinds of guests. You mentioned earlier, Al Murray was one of them. And I'll say it's always our British listeners that seem to get the most traction on our episode. So I've got my fingers crossed for you, and I hope to see some sales of Black Redcoats, the Corps of Colonial Marines, 1814 to 1816. I hope they skyrocket for you. I hope this puts your name on the map, man. And you know what? We'll be the two individuals that seemingly share a brain cell that fights for third place from time to time.
We'll be in the acknowledgments of the next book, the sequel.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's it.
Easy.
That's it.
Yeah.
So some big homebrew news because we teased it in the very beginning. Homebrew History will now air weekly. That's right. If you thought, twice a month, that's depressing. I have to go 2 weeks, and not anymore. Not anymore, friends. Now that the life of a stay-at-home father and an author and researcher has become my 24/7 gig. I have a lot more time on my hands, which means we can do a lot more of this. So we're now airing weekly episodes. So you can catch Matt this week when you're listening to this, and then be ready for yet another episode to come out the very next week. And if that's not enough, right? you're listening to every episode and you follow along with us on Facebook and other forms of social media, Instagram, Blue Sky, because we left Twitter because it's a garbage fire. You can also join us on Buy Me a Coffee, which you'll see the link for that down below in the description as well, where you'll get some kind of bonus features here and there, including some more content with Bo and I.
It's
But
not that
as
content.
always, it's clean and we have our clothes on. It's not
Safe
that
for
kind.
work. Safe for work.
So we stayed away from the idea of the OnlyFans. We were told to vie away, so we did.
For now.
But you've been listening to Homebrew History, sponsored by Civil War Trails and designed by Jeff Williams, bearded historian. I am Joseph Ricky on behalf of Bo Trissler and Matt Taylor. Thanks for listening to yet another episode of Homebrew History.